Someone made a video arguing that ogres are the best race to live as in Warhammer Fantasy. The central claim stated flat: there isn't a single miserable ogre in existence. Then you meet the Gorgers. Gorgers are degenerate ogres found in warpstone-tainted caverns below the tribes that spawned them. According to the Lexicanum, one of the primary repositories for Games Workshop lore, their existence is explicitly tied to the birth of scrawny ogres. The Lexicanum quote cuts off mid-sentence in the available sourcing, so the precise mechanism by which a scrawny ogre transitions from cradle to cave can't be confirmed from primary text. What the record does confirm: Gorgers are degenerate. They are subterranean. They live below the tribes that spawned them, and they got there somehow. Community lore, widely reported in community sources, holds that undersized or misshapen ogre infants get thrown into those caves as a cultural culling. The primary text doesn't hand us that sentence complete, but it hands us everything around it. The confirmed existence of Gorgers, their confirmed connection to scrawny births, and the confirmed geography of warpstone tunnels running below the tribe that produced them. The shape of what's missing isn't a flattering one. Picture it from ground level. An ogre tribe camps somewhere in the shadow of the Mountains of Mourn. Fires, carcasses, the smell of rendered fat and old blood. A birth happens. The infant is wrong. Too thin, too small, the proportions off in ways that every adult in the tribe reads immediately as a verdict. There's no deliberation recorded in the lore. There's no ceremony described in the primary text. What there is, beneath the camp, is a cave. And what comes out of that cave eventually, years later, isn't an ogre anymore. It's something that moves in the dark and tears at anything it can reach and has lost whatever thread connected it to the species it came from. That is Exhibit 1. We'll get to the rest. In -2751 C, a warpstone comet struck the ogre homeland on the eastern steppes. The Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki, drawing from Games Workshop source material, describes what happened next in terms that don't require embellishment. All life around it boiled away in an instant. 2/3 of the ogre population were annihilated as the steppes liquefied under the hammer blow of an angry god. 2/3 in one day. Whatever the ogres were before that moment, brutal, vigorous, a functioning if savage species, 2/3 of them ended on that day, dissolved into liquefied steppe under an impact the lore itself frames not as accident, but as divine act. The comet didn't drift off course. Something threw it. 2/3 of a species isn't a disaster. It's an extinction event that failed to finish. The ogres didn't collapse. What they did instead is stranger and considerably more damning. The survivors did what survivors do. They ate. They ate everything. They ate the dead. They ate their weaker brethren. They ate until there was nothing left to eat. And then the Warhammer Fantasy Wiki confirms what happened. The strongest and hardiest of the ogres found that the gnawing hunger visited upon them at the time of the Great Maw's arrival wouldn't leave, even after they had eaten their weaker brethren. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Exhibit 2, they ate the bodies. It didn't help. That sentence is the load-bearing wall of this entire argument. Everything else, the Gorgers, the yetis, the priests, the theology, the total cosmic architecture of ogre existence, flows from that one confirmed, sourced, Tier 1 lore fact. The hunger the comet left behind wasn't physical. It couldn't be addressed by eating. It was metaphysical, a curse baked into the species at a level that eating can't reach. You can eat a city, the hunger remains. You can eat your own dead, the hunger remains. You can build an entire civilization organized around the single goal of feeding, and still the hunger remains. A commenter watching the original video put it plainly. The ogre life basically sounds like the life of a drug addict in many ways. That didn't come from a lore textbook. It came from someone watching an ogre's existence from the outside and recognizing the structure. Compulsion without satisfaction. Escalating behavior that produces diminishing returns. A biological drive that has been severed from its natural off switch, leaving only the need with none of the relief. That pattern runs through every confirmed ogre lore detail from -2750 IC onward. Walk through the daily reality. An ogre wakes up hungry, not the ordinary hunger of a large creature with high metabolic demand. This is the hunger that was visited upon them. The wiki's passive construction is doing real work there, marking it as something external and imposed rather than natural. The ogre eats enormously. By any reasonable biological standard, more than enough. The hunger shifts, but doesn't break. It recedes to something manageable for a few hours, then builds again. The ogre raids, kills, eats immediately in the field because waiting is functionally not an option. Returns to camp. Eats again at the communal fire. Sleeps. Wakes up hungry. Every single day of an ogre's life runs this loop. And the loop has no completion state. There is no version of the day that ends with the hunger satisfied. The best available outcome is that it gets quiet enough to sleep. That is managed torment, not vitality. The impact site didn't disappear after -2750 IC. It became the Great Maw, a vast crater that functions in ogre cosmology simultaneously as a physical location and as the supreme divine entity of ogre religion. The thing that killed 2/3 of their species and cursed the rest with inescapable hunger is the same thing they built a church around. The Butchers and Slaughtermasters, the ogre priest caste, are described in the Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki as emissaries of their divine Great Maw, held by their tribes in both awe and fear. Not love, not comfort, not hope. Awe and fear. A religion built on awe and fear doesn't offer the faithful liberation from suffering. It offers a framework for understanding why the exit door was bricked over, and why that's actually holy. The Maw doesn't promise ogres relief from the hunger. It demands feeding. It institutionalizes the hunger as sacred obligation, converts an inescapable curse into devotional practice, and deploys a priest caste to administer the conversion. The Butchers don't offer their tribe a path out. They offer vocabulary for why there isn't one. Picture a butcher at work. He's carved ritualistic wounds into his own gut, opened channels in his body that he keeps deliberately infected with the Maw's influence, because pain and hunger are, in his cosmological framework, the proof of proximity to the divine. He stands before his tribe at the fire and doesn't say, "The Great Maw will free us." He says, in whatever formulation the ritual demands, that the hunger is the point. The hunger is what makes an ogre, rather than something smaller and more forgettable. He eats something, probably still alive, and the tribe watches, and the watching is worship, and the worship reinforces the frame. This isn't suffering, this is identity. The God that cursed you is the same God you worship. The system that administers your suffering is the same system that defines your purpose. Every ogre who eats, and they all eat, constantly, desperately, is, in the cosmology their priests have constructed, performing an act of devotion to the entity that made eating an act of perpetual inadequacy. If you wanted to design a closed psychological trap, you couldn't build a tighter one. Now the lore goes somewhere physically darker. The canonical endpoint of what proximity to the Maw does to an ogre over generations isn't just chronic hunger, it's the yeti. General Ogre Kingdom's lore holds that after the comet impact, most ogres eventually migrated west, settling in and around the Mountains of Mourn. Some stayed near the crater. Over the centuries that followed, the Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki records what happened to those who remained. Over the centuries, the ogres that stayed to eke out a living amongst the dust-tainted sky castles of the Sky Titans regressed in nature until they became feral and bestial. They evolved white, shaggy fur and long talons. Thus was the mountaintop species known as the yetis born. They didn't die, they transformed. Whatever the mechanism, proximity to the crater was the common factor. The lore confirms the correlation even where it doesn't specify the cause. Sapience went first, presumably slowly, across generations, each cohort a little less capable of the reasoning that distinguishes a tribe member from a predator. Then the body restructured itself around the new reality. Fur for the altitude, talons for hunting, the full behavioral architecture of a territorial animal rather than a thinking creature. an ogre standing near the Maw crater shortly after minus 2750 IC, and a yeti of the current era share a bloodline. They share almost nothing else. The closest human mythological parallel is the Wendigo, a figure from Algonquian tradition who consumes human flesh under desperate circumstances and is progressively transformed by that act until what remains hungers without self and without end. Games Workshop doesn't invoke that mythology by name, and the parallel is an interpretive lens, not a stated design connection. But the lore facts map onto it with uncomfortable precision. Sustained proximity to the hunger source leads to physical transformation, and transformation leads to the total erasure of whatever made the creature sapient in the first place. The Yeti didn't choose this, the hunger chose it for them. The Gorgers represent a parallel track of degradation, running not through centuries of proximity, but through the biology of individual births. They aren't ogres who stayed near the Maw crater too long. They're ogres who arrived at the wrong end of the hunger economy within their own tribes. Too thin to compete, too small to fight, too weak to hold a place at the fire. The warpstone caves below ogre settlements are confirmed in the Lexicanum as warpstone-tainted caverns below the tribes that spawned them. How the warpstone came to saturate those tunnels isn't explained in the available source record. The lore establishes the geography without detailing the mechanism. What the Lexicanum does confirm is the end state. Gorgers are degenerate ogres, connected to scrawny ogre births, living in those caves below their tribes. The specific causal chain, whether warpstone exposure drives the degeneration, or whether it merely marks the territory where it happens, isn't spelled out in the available text. The connection to scrawny ogre births is in the Lexicanum text, even where that text cuts off. The specific act of culling, a tribe making a deliberate decision to consign the undersized to that fate, is community lore that is consistent and persistent across fan sources, but the source record can't fully confirm that specific mechanism. What doesn't need that confirmation? Gorgers exist. Gorgers are degenerate. Gorgers came from somewhere, and their confirmed geography, below the tribes that spawned them in warpstone-tainted caverns, suggests a relationship between the tribe above and the things below that isn't accidental or incidental. Below every ogre tribe, in warpstone-soaked tunnels, live the things their worst-case genetics produced: degenerate, feral, generated by the same biological lottery that produces every ogre birth, just landing on the wrong number. The tribe knows they're down there. The Lexicanum confirms the Gorgers inhabit caverns below the tribes that spawn them. Spawned, not simply adjacent to. The tribe eats at the communal fire, while, somewhere beneath their feet, the other outcome scratches at the dark. The original video built its thesis on a reading of ogre culture as a kind of crude vitalism. Ogres fight, eat, repeat. They don't agonize about their condition. There's a version of that observation that almost holds, because ogres don't appear to suffer existentially the way that, say, elves do. They don't write elegies. They don't build monuments to what was lost in minus 2750 IC. They don't seem to spend measurable cultural energy mourning the curse. But the absence of reflection on suffering isn't the same as the absence of suffering. A species that can't be satiated isn't happy. It's adapted. The distinction matters enormously. A species that adapted to hunger the way ogres did is building an entire civilization around the management of a permanent wound. A tyrant who conquered his rivals and feasts on tribute from a dozen lesser tribes. The butcher who has carved himself into a living conduit for divine hunger. The youngest ogre calf born into the most powerful tribe in the Mountains of Mourn. All of them wake up hungry on the first morning of their lives and every morning after until they die. The curse has no graduation ceremony. There is no point at which the Maw looks at an ogre's accumulated eating and declares the debt cleared. This is why the Skarbrand connection is worth addressing directly. Total War Warhammer 3 content depicts ogres fighting Khorne and /or Skarbrand. The audience flagged this. It generated the third highest meaningful engagement in the comment data on the original video. People wanted an answer. The honest answer is that no canonical explanation exists in any Games Workshop publication for why ogres would be fighting Khorne's forces. The Total War games are an adaptation, not primary lore. The imagery exists. The lore explanation does not. Filling that gap from here would be fabrication, and the majority of the people watching this already know their army books well enough to catch fabrication before the sentence ends. The gap is real. It stays a gap. Two pieces of community lore come up often in discussions of whether the Hunger Curse has any exit. The first is a Frost Lord anecdote involving wound fat as a way of managing hunger. The second is the claim that eating god flesh can satisfy the Ogre Curse, temporarily or permanently. Neither can be confirmed against any Games Workshop publication in the available primary source record. The wound fat anecdote returns 0 results across all sourced materials. The Godflesh claim derives from a single source, in-game dialogue from a Total War title, which is contested at best and doesn't carry army book authority at any level. Both details circulate widely and persistently in community discussion. They might be accurate, but presenting them as canon here would be exactly the kind of overclaiming the original video did. And the audience in this space notices that faster than anything else. They stay in the community lore column, not the prosecution's exhibit table. What remains, standing on confirmed sources alone, is already a complete case. In -2750 IC, the Maw killed 2/3 of the ogre species. The survivors ate each other, and the hunger stayed anyway. Confirmed, sourced, on the record. The god they now worship is the same entity that cursed them, administered through a priest caste that converts inescapable suffering into religious obligation. Confirmed from the Warhammer Fantasy fandom wiki's description of butchers as emissaries of their divine Great Maw, held in awe and fear. Those who stayed closest to the source of the curse over the centuries lost their minds along the way and became yetis. Confirmed, sourced, direct quote. At the bottom of every tribe's territory, in warpstone caves, live degenerate remnants connected to births the hunger economy couldn't sustain. Confirmed from the Lexicanum. And every ogre who fights, raids, and eats across the old world does so not because eating is sufficient, the lore establishes explicitly that it isn't, but because the curse doesn't have an off switch. Commenters on the original video reached for comparisons instinctively because the lore pattern is familiar from other contexts. One framed it as the American dream. Work harder, eat more. The prosperity is always one more raid away. And if you haven't reached satisfaction yet, the framework says that's a personal failure rather than a structural one. Another noted that if you replaced the Maw with NASCAR and read the rest aloud, you'd recognize something specific in contemporary culture. A third identified the entire ogre theological architecture as a form of legitimized primitivism, the hunger sacralized, the consumption rendered holy. The whole arrangement pointed at a void that can't be filled. These aren't cheap jokes at the lore's expense. They're the audience recognizing what the lore actually encodes. A species organized entirely around a hunger they can't satisfy, worshiping the source of that hunger, generating their most degraded members as a direct byproduct of the hunger economy, and calling the whole arrangement civilization. The dark comedy punchline is that it functions. Ogre society works. Tribes raid, tyrants hold power, butchers conduct their rituals, and the Maw, apparently, is placated enough that the species is still here. The success, in a way, makes the prosecution stronger rather than weaker. If ogres were simply dying, starving in the ruins of a post-comet wasteland, devolving en masse into yetis, you could call it a tragedy and move forward. Instead, they built something real and culturally coherent on top of an inescapable cosmic debt, which means every generation of ogre born after -2751 C inherited both the achievement and the debt simultaneously. With no way to separate them, and no mechanism to pay the debt down. The maw keeps collecting. The hunger keeps running. The butchers keep performing rituals to a god that is, in the most literal lore-accurate terms, a hole in the ground. The scar left by a comet that killed most of their species. And that hole hasn't been satisfied once in several thousand years of feeding. The wiki quote ends the argument before it can be reopened. The gnawing hunger wouldn't leave. Some factions in Warhammer have gods that protect them. Some have gods that are largely indifferent, absent from battlefields and deaf to prayers, leaving their followers to manage without divine input. The Ogres have a god that is literally a crater, and that crater keeps eating, and the hunger it imparted in -2752 C hasn't diminished by a measurable degree across the millennia since. If you think that's the worst deal available across these games, the comparison set gets complicated fast. The Tau in Warhammer 40,000 live under the greater good, a philosophy of collective welfare and universal purpose that looks, from certain angles, like something approaching a functional utopia. Basically God's perfect race, someone argued in the comments. Then there are the 40K orcs, who solve the hunger problem by replacing it with an entirely different category of compulsion, one that generates its own flavors of nightmare. Both of those are different scripts. Subscribe, and we'll build the case.